Let me kick us off by welcoming Lord David Frost, former Minister of State at the Cabinet Office and Chief Negotiator of Task Force Europe.
Indeed.
That's quite a good title. David's full remarks should be appearing on our website any moment now if you want to either read along or read them later. But David's going to make some remarks and then has very kindly agreed to take questions on Slido, if possible, from the audience. So, David, without further ado, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Anand. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here 6 years on, as you say. Feels like a moment to think about things. And it is a bit of a pity that the debate has not moved on in the way we thought it might have, but I think it should. And I'll say a bit about that as I talk. Is Brexit working? That's my exam question. And I'll cut to the chase and probably not surprise any of you by saying up front that I think it is working. I don't think we have any cause for regret about the decision the country's taken. And the solutions to the remaining problems that we have are not to be found in going backwards, but they're to be found in completing the process and following through on its logic. So perhaps more interesting, than the answer to the question is why I give the answer to the question. And in setting it out, I want to make 5 points. First of all, crucially, Brexit is about democracy. It's about ensuring decisions for this country are taken in this country after proper debate, and I think that's now beginning to happen. Second, although most of the hard work is done, Brexit is not complete yet. There are things still to do, most obviously in re-establishing arrangements in Northern Ireland which support the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, but not only there. Third, the view that Brexit is hitting us from an economic and trade perspective is, in my view, generated by those with a bit of an axe to grind on this subject and cannot be supported by any objective analysis of the figures. The UK has grown at much the same pace as other G7 countries since the referendum, and as the ONS have pointed out, our goods exports to the EU are at the highest level ever. Fourth, Brexit is not a thing in itself. And this is where we come on to, where the debate needs to change. It's a necessary gateway to what should, in my view, be a project of national renewal. And I think the government needs to get on with defining and implementing that project. And fifth and finally, I ask the question, what about our partners? Does the EU actually want Brexit to work? Can it rise above the current frictions and work with us as a partner, or will it continue to hassle and lecture us? So let me take these 5 points in turn. First of all then, Brexit's about democracy. That's a crucial test. As we all know, the few reliable polls about the drivers of the referendum result show that the most important reason behind it was to ensure that decisions about Britain are taken in Britain. Obviously, that's a slightly simplistic formulation. Every country is affected by external forces, clearly, especially a very open one like Britain. So I would phrase it more precisely to me something like, to ensure that decisions about the laws in force in Britain are taken in Britain, that decisions about international commitments are made with the consent of the UK government, and that British institutions are sovereign within the UK. And that's what we sought to achieve, the Boris Johnson government, in delivering Brexit after the middle of 2019, and it is, I think, what the government is still intending to do. So the description I've given is, of course, a description of the legal regime prevailing in most countries in the world. Only in Europe is it regarded as an eccentric thing to think that countries can manage their own affairs and relate in a constructive and open way with others without depriving themselves of self-government, without sharing their sovereignty, without accepting some degree of formal supervision from outside the borders. And it's a pity that that's regarded as an eccentric view in Europe, because my view is that national democracy and the nation state are not just the normal way, but the best way of organising a country's affairs. Where people have political debate, where they talk openly and honestly about the trade-offs between different options, you get different levels, better levels of engagement in politics generally, you get greater buy-in to the results. I think we are beginning to see this in Britain. Look at an area like trade policy, hitherto highly technocratic, run by lobby groups focused on Brussels rather than London, but I think now much more the subject of debate in our own parliament, with more discussion about the trade-offs and the options, and with the rapid creation of lots and lots of lobby groups, notably in agriculture, perhaps much more quickly than I had thought, in fact. Moreover, in Britain, we can now change everything by elections. We can change things for the worse or the better, and it's the job of politicians to win the arguments and stand by the results. In EU countries, many things can't be changed by elections, especially for countries in the euro. Trade policy, monetary policy, much of fiscal policy, employment policy, much of environment policy, and so on. So I don't find it particularly surprising that we see such churn in European party structures, or we see such high votes for anti-system parties like those we saw in France over the weekend. So in my view, democracy counts. Brexit automatically delivers democracy, so in that sense, it is working. Second, unfortunately, Brexit isn't fully complete yet. We are still paying the exit bill. Though it must be said that the sums involved, though large though they seemed at the time, obviously seemed dwarfed by the subsequent cost of the pandemic and the payment and debt we've taken on since then. We're still subject to Court of Justice jurisdiction until 2024, not only in Northern Ireland, but also in the rest of the UK for any infringements before our exit. And the EU has indeed already begun one such case for, in my view, transparently political reasons. It's only really at the end of 2024, when the money is paid largely and the court role has largely disappeared, that the last relics of the EU system have disappeared. Though even then, we're still committed to supporting this so-called independent monitoring body for citizens' rights, at least until 2028, and even then we can only wind it up with the EU's agreement. But of course, the biggest problem is in Northern Ireland, where the delicately balanced compromise that we tried to put in place in 2019, recognising we were running high levels of risk in doing so, has come apart much more quickly certainly than I thought, and I think most people thought. It's unfortunate that given all the sensitivities, in my view, the EU has refused to look at that compromise again, and has refused to help us put together something that would properly support the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and enjoy proper cross-community consent. In these circumstances, I think the British government has no choice but to act as it is doing. Its responsibility for the integrity of the country and for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement must be paramount. Third point, on the economics. There's a lot of noise around at the moment. It's unfortunately quite difficult to have a reasonable and rational debate about what the statistics are telling us, if anything, and I don't think they're telling us much at the moment, because of the determination of a small group of people, for example, the European movement to latch on to any number, usually out of context, and treat it as evidence that Brexit is, quote, failing. And I think only when this culture war has finally abated are we going to be able to have a sensible discussion about the numbers. But meanwhile, let's do what we can, looking at trade and the broader economics. So on trade first, I think the crucial point to make is that a decline in trade numbers is not the same thing as a decline in GDP, although you could be forgiven for missing this when you listen to some anti-Brexit campaigners. It is, of course, true that some academic work has tried to establish a clear linkage between trade, productivity and growth, and it's that work that underpinned the 2018 Government Economic Service report, and whose zombie figure of 4% GDP decline is still quoted by the OBR and others as if it were an actual fact. In my view, and not only in my view, that of other economists, this link is overplayed. Those studies primarily looked at the effect of opening up badly run ex-communist, ex-authoritarian, semi-autarkic economies, in which opening up was producing huge improvements in the policy regime generally, and in which the gains came from these broader improvements, not just from trade. It's, in my view, much more questionable and, in my view, far from established whether small changes in trade make any meaningful difference for advanced economies at the production frontier, like the UK. And we are talking about small changes. There's a huge amount of noise in the figures, obviously, because of the pandemic, because of supply chain disruption, because of trade diversion, because of the ONS measurement changes, which mean there's a discontinuity between this year and all the earlier figures, and now the war in the Ukraine, which has brought significant changes to oil and LNG flows via the UK. So it's hard to be confident what, if any, changes in UK trade are due to Brexit. Obviously, this is going to become clearer over time. But meanwhile, I think anyone who draws firm conclusions from the figures is not really being honest with the data. What we can be confident about, I think, is that it doesn't bear the catastrophism that some seek to attribute to it. And as I said at the start, the ONS said this month, I quote, EU exports have increased for the third consecutive month in April 2022 and are at the highest levels since records began. They also note that our trade in services surplus is actually increasing, despite all the predictions. So overall, it's obvious one wouldn't be being intellectually honest if one tried to deny that leaving the customs union and the single market will have some impact on trade. Obviously, it will. For what it's worth, I think it's reasonable to assess the figures that we've got so far as plausibly showing our goods exports are maybe 5% below what they otherwise would have been. But the performance is continuing to improve, and this may change further as figures and trade normalises. And I do not think it's going to have any measurable impact on our GDP one way or another. As for GDP itself, the study produced by the CER, again last month, has had a lot of attention. Unfortunately, I don't believe its sort of doppelganger methodology is particularly sound or a reliable basis on which to draw conclusions. Graham Gudgeon of Policy Exchange has produced a lengthy analysis of the problems with it, which I won't repeat now. But I will just note the fact that it changes the doppelganger group for different purposes in the study and has also changed the group compared to the previous version makes one doubtful about its predictive powers, as does the fact that it doesn't properly factor in differences in the cyclical positions of different economies or huge differences in the policy regimes over time, such as the Biden stimulus in the US. In my view, at the moment, the only sound conclusion we can draw on GDP is the one that Policy Exchange do draw, which is that, and I quote, a more straightforward comparison with the major economies of the G7 reveals there is no obvious Brexit-related lag in the UK's economic performance measured by per capita GDP. The UK economy has grown at much the same rate as the G7 average since the Brexit referendum in 2016, end quote. Fourth point, Brexit should be just the beginning of a broader project of national renewal for this country. Brexit is a gateway. We have to go through it. It isn't a thing itself. The crucial thing is what it frees up by way of choices, by way of agency for this country. And in my view, one of the harmful effects of EU membership, I've said this before, was that it gradually deprived our policymakers, politicians, civil servants alike of agency. It fostered a belief, not always or even often acknowledged, that we weren't capable of solving our own problems on our own. Every policy initiative had to be Brussels-proofed because of the reach of the principles of EU law, non-discrimination and so on. The creep of EU law in areas like citizenship squeezed out areas of discretion. And there was generally a strong habit of consulting Brussels on many issues because of the potential impact on competition law, possible state aid effects, and so on and so on. And I think we can actually see the effects of these habits now we've left. Our policy elites, I think, have lost the habit of defining goals, creating strategies to deliver them, crafting policies that support the strategies. They found it very difficult, and we can see this now, they found it very difficult to draw up genuine proposals for liberalisation and changes in policy regimes now we've left, even on pieces of legislation that we opposed when we were members. It's almost as if we've forgotten how to govern. I've no doubt this is going to change over time. where there are immediate pressures and immediate challenges, we are showing we can and do act differently. This was true on vaccine policy famously, where although we may have had the formal right to forge our own way as an EU member, I've no doubt we would certainly not have done so. It's even more obvious at the moment on Ukraine policy. We always said that outside the EU, our ability to act quickly and decisively, to lead and set a policy agenda, would be more important than having a 1/8 share, or whatever it is, in the policy of a larger entity, and so it has proved. But the task now is to devise a meaningful programme of supply-side reform focused on boosting the productive capacity of the economy and to drive it through. And I made no secret of my view in recent months that the government has not tackled this anything like energetically enough so far. And if Brexit is to produce a visible economic payoff, then the government's going to have to raise its game very significantly. I do hope that the process Jacob Rees-Mogg launched yesterday will kick off a different approach, and we look forward to this Brexit Opportunities Bill, which is going to follow. The crucial thing for me is, will it have a robust sunset clause or not that really changes the incentives and makes a real difference? Finally, my final point, does the rest of the world actually want us to succeed? Actually, of course, most of the world seems blithely unbothered about Brexit one way or another. Certainly doesn't see it as any sort of difficulty for them or for us. In the US, the party split on Brexit is, I think, gradually waning, despite the noise on Northern Ireland. We've heard a bit less sniffiness from Democratic Party elites and think tankers since the start of the war in Ukraine, and this, I think, has made them realise our value as an ally and our capacity to shape events, in part, independently. The question is obviously really about the EU itself, by which I mean the policy elites, of course, not the average European citizen. So far, their observed behaviour isn't particularly encouraging. It is, of course, open to the Commission and their allies amongst the Member States to insist on every word of the Northern Ireland Protocol and to take us to the Court of Justice if they want. We could, of course, open arbitration ourselves for the refusal to deliver on the commitment to join Horizon, but we don't behave in the same way to the EU as they do to us. It's, of course, open to them to police UK goods trade as if it had not come from a friendly neighbour with a highly reputable and transparent policy regime, even though we don't do the same to them. It is, of course, open to them to treat every UK tourist as a potential overstayer, to refuse any change to standard Schengen and future ETA terms, to forbid use of e-gates, and so on, even though we don't do the same to them. And through all this, we have to take lectures about the decline of trust and international law, while at the same time, the Court of Justice asserts its own superiority over international arbitration rulings, and the EU itself ignores WTO judgments when it suits it. And when it has been German policy to ignore warnings about Russia for many years, and as a result, major EU member states continuing to pay large sums for Russia for energy, which helped finance this evil war in Ukraine. In these circumstances, the lectures we take land badly and do not help. The question the Commission have got to ask is whether any of this is actually in their strategic interest. Do they want the UK as a friendly and collaborative neighbour, or a disgruntled one which is looking elsewhere? Do the Commission and key member states see it as in their interest to sustain the current UK trade policy, which is actually a massive trade preference scheme for the European Union, or do they want us to actively look elsewhere? And an interesting question, would Poland and France, to take two countries at random, would they give the same answers to those questions? The EU may feel is stronger if Brexit sort of fails, in the sense that further secession will look less attractive, and that's obviously been a big driver of their policy. In reality, though, the EU will be weaker because it will have shown itself to the world as an entity that lacks self-confidence in its ability to reform itself and find collaborative relations with its neighbours. And in that sense, the West overall will be weaker, not stronger, if the EU insists on going down this road. And that bigger picture for the West does matter. It's so important that we find resolution to these issues in a collaborative way. In my Churchill lecture in Zurich in March, I set out areas where we could find, if you like, a new entente cordiale, with the EU more open to changing the protocol, us being more willing to look at foreign policy collaboration with the EU, and some mutual de-escalation on various border and visa issues. That still seems a possible way forward to me, but it does take two to do it. It's really up to the EU how it wishes to proceed. And to conclude, for our part, our destiny is now in our hands as a country. We can, and I hope will, succeed whatever the EU does. It will just be more difficult for everybody if it insists on being difficult rather than collaborative. It would be much better to put the history behind us on both sides and concentrate on making this new relationship work. There's absolutely no reason why that can't happen. It just takes vision, it just takes will. Thank you very much.
David, thank you. Judging from the smoke emanating from this iPad, you've provoked
I thought
quite,
I might, so I must
quite a few people.
Yeah.
Can I just say, which I forgot to say right at the start of the day, that please do vote for the questions you want posed to speakers or panellists, because that makes my job a lot easier. And it makes it easier to be populist if you can just show your support for which questions. I've got a couple of questions just to kick us off. I suppose the first one is to turn the question, your exam question, on its head and say, what evidence would convince you that Brexit had failed? Not that Brexit has been done badly by whoever happens to be in power, but that actually you were wrong.
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think I'm not sure it is ever going to be clear in that sense whether it's succeeded or failed, because so much else is going on, and extracting the causality about this is always going to be extremely difficult, I would say, and the counterfactuals, and we know about that. I mean, I think one piece of evidence of failure would be if we are still debating this in 5-6 years' time in the same way. I think if it's to succeed, it needs to settle in the British polity, and there needs to be broad consensus that this is how we're going forward. I don't think we're quite there at the moment, but I am not sure we'll ever get kind of economic evidence one way or the other that is going to prove this. The tests are broader. The tests are about democracy as well as economics, and as I say, that's already established.
Okay, and the second one, you said this is about democracy, and you seem to define democracy as decisions being taken in the UK. But an important question there is by whom? Because for some people, what you've seen post-Brexit is not just the UK taking back control, but the executive executing an enormous power grab, either by its attitude to the courts or by its use of statutory instruments or by the sort of bills that you see in Parliament replete with Henry VIII powers. I mean, for decisions to be democratic, who should be taking them?
So, I mean, it certainly doesn't feel like that when you're in the executive, I've got to say, that, that we suddenly were able to kind of make our will tell. I don't think it has been like that. I think it's very exaggerated. I don't think anyone particularly thinks Henry VIII powers are ideal, but sometimes they're the only way through to achieve things. I think that the point is these things are open to national debate. The precise balance between the executive, the legislature and the courts, and obviously that latter point has already been discussed quite a lot this morning because of the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
That all those questions are up for national debate and can be changed by national debate. And I think this country has proved pretty good historically at resolving those questions through normal politics and finding a balance between the different powers that works. And I don't see any reason why that shouldn't continue. So for me, it's certainly not about exerting the power of the executive. It's about bringing the balance home so it can be discussed meaningfully in the UK and, if necessary, changed.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here from Paul Giles. I mean, it goes back to the referendum, which I suppose on anniversary day we can do. If you go back to that campaign of 2016, he asked which of those, based on which criteria from the Leave campaign can you now argue that Brexit is working? So, I mean, linking today to then, I suppose.
Well, I don't know, whether it's an easy answer to give, to be honest. After all, we didn't actually leave the EU until 4 years after the campaign, or at least leave the economic aspects of it. So we have, such evidence there is based on a very short period. I don't know whether there's a lot of value in kind of rerunning what was said during the referendum campaign now. After all, an immediate economic crash was also predicted by the Remain side, and that definitely did not happen. I think if you went through the leaflets and the commitments, you'd probably find both sides' predictions had been, some have been validated and some invalidated by events, but that's just real life, that happens. I don't think it changes the fundamental issues that were at stake in that referendum campaign about democracy, about control, and so on.
Okay, I mean, I buy the point about this being about democracy, but can we just, I think we should turn to some of the economics now. And there's a question from Jill Rutter, which I think sort of gets to the nub of some of these debates, which is, would the government, you accept that Brexit might cause some problems economically, though you dispute the scale of them. Do you think one of the problems we have is because government is just fundamentally unwilling to acknowledge any of those problems, it makes it harder to tackle them? Wouldn't it be easier if everyone was just a bit more honest?
I definitely would. I mean, it's a general problem with government, obviously, that it finds it difficult to acknowledge failure. Yeah. And, that's why you get so many zombie policies being kind of continued and while the world moves on. And I don't think the Leave campaign, I don't mean during the referendum, I mean generally, I don't think it's really helped itself by kind of ignoring some of these trade-offs. And certainly as long as I've spoken publicly, I've always said there is, if you go back to my Brussels speech at the beginning of 2020, in that I said, obviously there's a cost in leaving the customs union and the single market. I think it would be much better to be honest about these things and show where the possibilities for doing ththings better really existed, rather than sort of pretending that nothing is going on. And that's why, I mean, as you heard what I said in the speech, I don't think it's reasonable to say, as some pro-Brexit people do, that nothing to see here in the figures, don't bother looking at them, it really is not important. I don't think that's fair. You have to look at the figures, they're telling you something. I just don't believe they bear the constructions that are put on them at the moment.
I mean, I should add that quite a lot of people in this debate don't actually go further than that and simply make ad hominem attacks on the people who are raising the figures rather than actually talking about the substance. I think that's true of both sides to an extent, but I don't know if you saw the report put out by the Resolution Foundation yesterday.
I've seen reports of it.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, we now have some evidence, don't we? We're not just talking about forecasts. And what was quite striking in that report was two things, I think. Firstly, that they said that economists had been wrong to forecast a fall in exports to the European Union because they seem to be holding up quite well. But the data suggests a relative decline in UK openness and competitiveness, which over the medium term would have severe consequences for the economy. I mean, what did you make? I mean, you haven't read it, so it may be an unfair question to ask you.
No, but I mean, I think it's based on the same a sort of fundamental economic view that I was critiquing in the speech, that there is a linear connection between openness and growth, and I don't think it's like that. Otherwise, I mean, for one thing, you get to the sort of reductio ad absurdum, that the logical conclusion is that every country's better off if it imports and exports all its GDP and imports it all from somewhere else. If there is that direct link, at some point that link no longer is true. And I certainly think at the production frontier margin, it makes a sort of relatively little difference. Second point, though, the degree of openness in our own economy, the degree of competitive forces bearing on it is to some extent in our own hands. We should have a much more active competition policy in this country. There are plenty of areas CMA could look at, and for whatever reason chooses not to. We should be getting down our own tariffs much faster, so there's much more competition on our own market. There are lots of things we can do to change that balance. We definitely should. It's obvious that leaving a customs union, a single market, has an impact on openness, but that's not the only thing that's going on. And that's why I'm a little bit frustrated the government isn't moving faster to do some of these things that actually would make a difference.
I mean, would you accept that Brexit is having some impact on the cost of living crisis?
I mean, honestly, I don't know. I don't think you can say that if you look at inflation figures across Europe. They move around all the time, but they're all in a band where there is a serious inflation problem. And if you isolate food prices, in some European countries they're going up higher, and in some countries they're going up more slowly. So honestly, I don't really think you can say that. I don't think the data stacks it up at the moment.
Okay, we've got. Are you not able to access the Slido?
I've cycled 40 miles here.
All right. If you've got a very quick question, then go ahead.
Yes, it's Peter Cook, a compatriot of David Frost, I believe. It's about truth and trust in politics. I thought your presentation was excellent, by the way. I've not heard such good presentation about what we can expect. Of course, I'd have liked to have heard that in 2016. But you can't deny that the Brexit debate has devalued truth and trust in politics. And I was talking to someone the other day, and they thought that to cure this problem, perhaps it'd be a good idea if question time or Parliament, people could be, if they lied, for example, they would be tasered. Do you agree with that premise, David? If so, would you like to take the clinical trial first? But more importantly, I suppose you're not.
If you don't have a question, can you sit down? Because we're short of time. And
Does he agree or disagree with the question? That's the question.
Thank you.
Has Brexit devalued truth in politics? No, I don't think it has. I think British politics has changed quite a lot in the last 15, 20 years. And I don't think Brexit has been a big factor in the content of our political debate. I could make just as many critiques ad hominem and otherwise of, how we got into the Iraq War and so on. I think there are tendencies and processes in the way we do politics that are a bit problematic, unfortunately. But just one comment on this truth in politics and, is somebody lying? Are they telling the truth? I do think this oversimplifies it. There are relatively few questions in politics where somebody says something is black and it's actually white. Actually, it's usually more complex than that in policy terms. Very often depends what you are trying to do with a policy, whether it is successful or not, whether it works. I don't think it is possible to say very often that statements are clearly misleading, clearly wrong in black and white terms. I think you have to bring context to these things. You have to look at what people are trying to do. And a proper political debate will make sure the truth comes out. And I've said before, on the question of COVID, what everyone thinks of lockdowns and all of that, what happened in this country, and it didn't happen in many others, was that it was not possible to shut up a group of a segment of political opinion that said lockdowns aren't working, we don't need to do it again in last Christmas. And in the end, that won the argument. And, that strength of political debate, refusal of some groups to be shut up, force a debate about things, takes you in the right position. I think that's a much better way of solving things than having some, kind of body, a grand version of full fact that says you're telling the truth and you're not.
OK, well, seeing as you mentioned full fact, I mean, surely it is wrong that the Prime Minister can repeatedly make the claim that is factually wrong about there being more people in employment than pre-pandemic, having been corrected by the Office of National Statistics, corrected by full fact. and then serially repeating it. There's something wrong with that, isn't there, in our politics, that can't be stopped?
Well, I don't know who would stop it. I mean, I wish you wouldn't say things like that are obviously not true. I'm not going to defend making factually incorrect statements, but in the end, it's for the Prime Minister's own party and MPs to decide, is that how they want to do things or is it not? I don't think you can have a kind of a body of platonic guardians that comes down and says you can't say that.
Okay. We've only got a few minutes left, and we can't end this session without talking about the protocol, I don't think. So I suppose the first question, I hear this is a question that the current Foreign Secretary hates, is why are you not applying it? You signed it. And not only did you sign it, but the government's own impact assessments told you how the EU would approach the implementation of this thing. And a bunch of Brexit supporters who had in part based their case for Brexit on the fact that the EU was unnecessarily legalistic can hardly credibly turn around and say, we never expected the EU to be so legalistic. I mean, wasn't this all very predictable?
I wouldn't put it like that. I wouldn't say that, we never expected it. What I think we could reasonably have expected, because there are provisions in the protocol requiring it, is a more sensitive implementation of some of the provisions. For example, the provision that says everyone should try and minimise checks and controls at Northern Ireland ports. That nobody's ever really tried to do that on the EU side, as far as I can see. Quite the reverse. We have the whoever it was, the Commission's auditors coming and complaining about the fact that people's luggage isn't being opened when they go from GB to Northern Ireland. That's not what it's about. But I think there's I do think that the real world test is important. That whether you like it or not, we hoped that this protocol would support the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and would be supported in time by both sides, and it hasn't. It hasn't been supported by both sides. It is undermining the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. We have to look at it again. I think there's just a kind of real world thing going on that means you've got to do this. And as I said before, our treaty with France over juxtaposed controls, which is quite a sensitive question, has been renegotiated 3 times, usually at French request, because we've had the circumstances have changed. And I just don't see what is so unreasonable and unusual about this that it should be refused.
Okay, I mean, that's the sort of border issue, but one of the things in the current debate is, and that was in your command paper when you were still in office, was the desire to remove the role of the European Court of Justice. But the European Court of Justice hasn't done anything yet. So what could possibly have changed about the role of the court in that agreement since you signed it that makes you want to remove it now? How do you justify that?
Well, I mean, the protocol includes 2 provisions, obviously, for dispute settlement. It does include normal arbitration and it includes infraction. And I think, it is reasonable to expect that in a circumstance like Northern Ireland, you might use arbitration before immediately going to the court, which is in principle an internal EU mechanism. I think that it is true, no issue has got to the court yet, but we've now got 3 infraction cases. And in fact, the EU's knee-jerk response over the imposition of grace periods was not to open discussions. It wasn't even start arbitration. It was immediately to go to an infraction process, which will end up in the courts. And I think the real-world way this has been used means we're right to be highly suspicious of the role of the Court of Justice in future in this protocol. I think it was more, I mean, maybe we were naive, perhaps we were. For me, it was a long stop. Arbitration is the normal way of resolving these things. If it was egregious kind of ignoring of things, that's different, but it's not being used like that. And, after one of these, if the EU asks for urgency, one of these cases is going to be in the Court of Justice pretty soon, and we will be presented with the reality of this question quite quickly.
But do you think unilateral action via the Northern Ireland Protocol bill is the best way of either resolving the dispute with the EU or of dealing with the genuine problems that there are in Northern Ireland?
I think it's the only possible remaining way, unfortunately, after, it's now nearly a year since the command paper last year, which I think was a reasonable way of resolving it. Of course, we were willing to talk around it, but there's been no serious discussion of the problems that we put forward. The ideas the EU put forward last autumn and repeated by Maroš a couple of weeks ago, I mean, they don't get close to resolving the politics of the issue in Northern Ireland, and I just don't see what alternative is left, to be honest.
Would it not have been less incendiary to try Article 16 first?
Well, I mean, I must, I'm kind of intrigued as to why Article 16 isn't there. I think there are some traces in, for example, the government's legal opinion that suggests they haven't ruled it out as a way forward yet. And obviously it would enable you to act much more quickly than the bill does, because it's obviously going to take some time to go through. So my impression is it's not ruled out as a way forward if things continue to deteriorate, but it is only a provisional solution. I think what the government's put forward will be a definitive solution, at least in the UK domestic legal order, and that is important for clarity.
Okay, and finally, I mean, in your speech, you set out what is a very ambitious agenda for Brexit of national renewal. Do you think this government, which is increasingly weak, within which we have a Prime Minister who is spending, it seems, most of his time battling for his survival, is capable of delivering anything like that vision?
Well, I hope it is. I mean, that's partly why, anticipating that is partly why I made my comment about people have forgotten how to do strategy and politics and define goals and so on. I think this is a general weakness in our governing class at the moment, as we get used to having our hands on the levers again in a way that we haven't in the past. I'm not sure what more I can say other than I don't think it's got to grips with the problems so far, and I hope it will in the next 2 or 3 months.
Are you confident?
Let's see what happens.
Okay. David, thank you very much indeed for coming and speaking to us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.